I'm live. Just as well it's a rainy Sunday because I just realized I read chapter 3 of this third part of Time Out of Mind twice. When I was reading it, I felt that sounds very familiar, but sometimes I have read ahead a little bit to know what's happening. And whilst reading on, I thought, I think this is very familiar. So, I'm now reading chapter 4. This is a book, an autobiography by Joan Grant. It explains her ability, or it explains how she wrote books like Winged Pharaoh and Life as Carola. It's a horrible Sunday. It's Sunday the 30th of July, and I am now continuing with chapter 4 from part 3 of Time Out of Mind. Chapter 4. Snakes and Charmers. On the boat coming out from England, the young and gay couple, Clotilde and Martinez de Silva Prado, who were returning from their honeymoon in Paris, invited us to stay with them on their coffee fazenda. The Grants seemed to think we were not only eccentric but mildly insane to accept such a casual invitation. Why did we want to go dashing off to stay with Brazilians, especially shipboard acquaintances who had undoubtedly forgotten our existence? They haven't forgotten us, I said smugly, and produced a cable to prove that not only were we welcome, but our host and hostesses were going to meet us in Sao Paulo, which was 300 or 400 miles from where they lived. Leslie was rather worried that we might offend his family, so I pointed out that I had not come over 10,000 miles only to see a country that was flatter and far more ugly than the dreariest parts of Cambridgeshire, not only to meet people who, nice as they were, I could have met just as well in Inverness or Woking. In spite of any poker winnings, money was rather short, so we bought a passage on an American freighter which sailed for Santos on the 17th of April. Elsie and Ronald came to see us off, and their doubts as to our sanity increased when they saw the boat. We were the only passengers, or else the cockroaches had already eaten the occupants of the other two cabins. She was held together by optimism and trust, and it was obvious that her owners had long ago decided not to waste any more money or paint on her. As she wallowed through the muddy waters of the River Plate, we looked rather apprehensively at large shiny brass plaque in the salon, the only brass work that was ever polished. It consigned into the hands of Almighty God the ship's personnel mustering them in the order in which they should receive divine attention. At the top, the captain, and under this, in letters only a little smaller, the first mate, then on down the hierarchy. At the bottom, in letters so small that they could only just be read with the naked eye, an afterthought. And even those who are with us only as guests. We could only hope that in the eye of God we were as conspicuous as sparrows. The captain was called Grant, and frequently congratulated me on having a fine old American name, which Leslie considered a deliberate slight to the Highlands. He was a genial man, even in his cups, from which he seldom emerged, and he often invited me up to the bridge and allowed me to steer. I enjoyed this until a rather rough evening when I heard a thud and turned to see the captain lying unconscious on the deck behind me. The inhospitable coast was far too close to the port bow for comfort, so I thought it wiser to steer out to sea, a course I held for rather over an hour, until someone came to relieve me at the wheel. This episode was considered enormously funny by everyone on board except Leslie and me. But we reached Santos, in those days a scruffy little town, steaming among mangrove swamps, and from there went to Sao Paulo, on a rack and pinion railway which wound up the encampment in hairpin bends so sharp that the baggage car was often directly below the engine. There Clotilde and Martinez were waiting for us, and that night they took us to a party in our honour, which was a vivid contrast to the more sombre entertainments of Hurlingham. There were 10 men and 10 women, all Brazilian, who spoke fluent English, although none had ever been to England. The women who spent at least 3 months in Paris every year had lovely clothes and magnificent diamonds and were the most beautiful women I or Leslie had ever seen. It was not only their looks, but their ebullience, which was so outstanding. For centuries, the men of Brazil's first families had kept their women as nicely as the aristocrats of Spain. Divorce on paper was very easy for a woman to obtain, but so socially impossible that none of them had ever dared to use their legal escape hatch. But a year before, the downtrodden wives had suddenly realized that if 20 of them all simultaneously divorced their husbands, which would automatically give them not only their freedom but a third of their husband's capital, society could not cut them, for they constituted the society of which they had been so afraid. The party was in the home of a bachelor friend of Martinez. The women were shown into a remarkable bedroom. The walls, the curtains, and the hangings of an enormous four-poster bed were of Parma violet velvet. The doors of a huge clothes press stood open. On padded hangers were at least 50 superb nightdresses, lace chiffon, finest embroidered lawn. The dressing table held more bottles than a well-stocked bar, but these were scent bottles. A door led us to a lavish bathroom, another door to a room so monastic that it might have been a cell except for wrecks of riding boots and guns. "Which one is his mistress?" I whispered to Clotilde, so as to be sure to thank my unofficial hostess. She laughed. "Who knows which she will be?" I was a little embarrassed. Perhaps I ought not to have noticed the nightgowns, the scent, but surely if our host was trying to be discreet, he ought at least to have made sure that the cupboard was shut. The dinner started at 9, and at midnight, after 20 courses, there was a sorbet and coffee. After an interval of an hour, the dinner started again. Beefsteak with an egg on top, and a further 10 courses. Sometimes, between courses, a man would raise his glass to a woman, and if she smiled, they could go out of the room together for a few minutes, as casually as if they were going to take a turn round the dance floor of a nightclub. But there was no music, so I thought they were going for a stroll in the garden. I should have liked to have gone too, for it was very hot indoors, even though the air was cooled by a fountain at the end of the room. It was not until next day that Leslie discovered the purpose of the nightgowns. They were for the lady guests, who could not be expected to bring their own, as though they had been children carrying their slippers to a dancing class, and were far too well brought up to be seen naked, even in such a richly curtained bed. Clotilde and Martinez thought my ingenuousness uproariously funny, which must still have rankled when Martinez called at the snake farm to pick up a fresh supply of serum the following day. The last thing I wanted to do was to see snakes, or even to think about them, but I tried to show off by casually mentioning that I had typed several letters from my father to the director on the subject of mosquitoes. Unfortunately, father's name rang a bell with a distinguished gentleman, who greeted me most warmly and said that he would be delighted to show me everything. The more fervently I insisted I would not dream of wasting his time, the more he insisted that I should not leave him until I had a clear picture of the important work done there, to take back to my father, his illustrious colleague. "I will wait in the car," said Martinez. "No, no," cried the director. "Go away until this evening. There is much for her to see, much to talk about." Miserably, I watched Martinez drive away, and then, with Leslie, followed the enthusiastic little man into the first of several laboratories which I was to enter on that far too memorable day. In the first one there was a desk, a typewriter, several files lying open on a long wooden table. It all looked so harmless that I thought, if I thought about it at all, that the tiers of little cupboards along the wall held vials of serum or something, even more innocuous, such as card indexes. I was looking at some coloured drawings of snakes, which were to be made into posters, so that people would be able to recognize which kinds were needed at the farm, when I heard a heavy plop behind me. It was a snake, about 6 feet long and as thick as my arm. The director made a toot-toot noise of annoyance and casually picked it up by the back of the head. "That lab boy of mine is getting most careless. Always I tell him to be sure the cages are properly fastened." He smiled at the snake. "This little fellow is quite harmless today, for he was milked of his venom this morning," See, I will show you. He pinched the snake's cheeks and forced its jaws open. Then he picked up a little glass dish with gaze stretched tightly over it, through which he gently pressed the fangs. There, not a drop left. You see? He sounded placid as a milkmaid. Tomorrow perhaps a drop or two, and in 4 days ready for another milking. He held out the snake to me. You would like to hold him? He might have been offering a kitten to a child. Involuntarily, I backed away. I might drop it, I protested feebly. He looked surprised. He's not heavy, but I'll give it to your husband. For a full minute, Leslie clutched the snake around the middle, its head pointing away from him, its tail vainly trying to get a coil around his arm. Then it writhed around until it could stare him in the face. Leslie endured its hissing for a few seconds, and then with a strangled yelp flung it to the room. You must not be rough with them, said the director severely. The snake was now so angry that he had to use a forked stick to hold it down before he could handle it back into its cage. Leslie was pale and sweating. I think more because he thought he had made a fool of himself than from the simple horror which I was feeling. The director fixed him with a disapproving eye. It is clear that you do not share your wife's interest in scientific matters. It might be better if you were to leave her here with me. I will myself escort her back to your hotel this evening. My secretary will telephone for your taxi. And Leslie, mumbling that perhaps Martinez would think it discourteous if neither of us went back to lunch with him, cravenly left me, and, like a fool, I stayed. My early training had taught me how to share the enthusiasm of scientists. I once spent 4 happy days entertaining, in father's absence, a Chinese professor whose only subject was tapeworms. But though the kind director did everything in his power to make me enjoy that long and dreadful day, I still find it one of the things I try not to remember. Yet he seemed pleased with me and, like an unusually generous child, insisted on showing me more and more of his treasures. His favourites at the time were tarantulas, which, like huge hairy crabs, scuttled to and fro in cages about half the size of a billiard table. Their bite, he assured me, was more dangerous than a snake's, because as yet no antidote to their venom had been discovered. These were only the hors d'oeuvres. He then showed me racks of human arms and legs, mummified by some process to which I lent a most inattentive ear, that had rotted off their still living owners. There were bloated babies in bottles, children bobbing about in large jar glass, and the piece de resistance was a Negro floating in a tank of formaldehyde and awaiting dissection. He must have been a large man before the snake bit him. Now he was gigantic. They swell, oh how they swell, said the director thoughtfully. The Indian snakes and most of these snakes of Africa, 2 little punches in the skin is all there is to see. Then the heart stops. Pain, yes, but not this gross distortion. I managed to make some inarticulate noise, being almost speechless with horror. He seemed to think I was accusing him of exaggeration. They swell, I tell you, swell until they burst like overripe fruit. He swept off his shirt. Look at my back, look at it. I did, with eyes I thought soon must glaze. There was a scar running up his arm to the shoulder, across his back until it disappeared under his trousers. A scar like a purple satin ribbon, 2 inches wide. He put on his shirt again and sat down at the desk. We were now in his study, where we had lunched off a tray. He was no longer the fellow scientist or the child sharing its toys, but the stern schoolmaster lecturing a foolhardy pupil. I've shown you this scar to impress upon your mind that while you are in my country, you must be careful of snakes. He wagged an admonitory finger at me. How did this happen to me, you ask yourself? Was I in the jungle when a coral snake flung itself at me from a branch? Was I walking barefoot in long grass? Am I a fool who picks up a snake because he thinks it's one of the harmless ones? The questions were purely rhetorical. He was gripped as I was by his narrative, as though by an anaconda. None of these foolish things was I doing, yet the thing I did was foolish. I was in this room, and in the corner, as there is now, was a little hamper of coral snakes which I wished to examine at my leisure. I opened it. There they lay, 4 of them, torpid at the end of a long journey. But there was one, a little one, clinging to the lid as I flung it back. I'm quick, but he is quicker. He strikes me in the shoulder. I throw him back into the hamper. It is never allowed to leave poisonous snakes loose in the room. He said this severely, as though it were a careless habit of mine he had constantly to rebuke. Then I pick up this hypodermic. He took one from a covered dish on his desk and made a graphic gesture with it. It is filled with fresh serum. It is my rule that there is one ready in every room in this building. I plunged it into my arm quickly, no time to waste in swabbing the skin with alcohol. Then I ring the alarm bell. He pointed at it. An electric bell push painted scarlet, and I remember seeing similar ones in every other room we had been to. Only just in time did he stop himself ringing it again. When I rang it, people came running. In 2 minutes they were with me, but I was already almost unconscious. I was very unhappy for several days. It is not comfortable to swell and swell until the skin must burst. He leant back in his chair and looked at me almost pleadingly. Signora, have I said enough to make you promise not to be careless with snakes? I think he has, don't you? So this was the end of chapter 4, and the next one is called Coffee for Sayanda, but I only read it once. Happy Sunday.